Welcome back, class. What we're going to do with this presentation is just go over some of the basic background information for Freud. Freud and psychoanalysis. Well, first we want to start off talking about the antecedents of the development of psychoanalysis, looking at what factors played a role, somewhat significant role, in the development of Freud's theory. First, let's look at the components of the theory that existed prior to his theory. A case can be made that all components of the theory existed prior to the theory. This iceberg image that we see here is one of the common ones that we do see with regards to Freud, looking at personality structures of the id, ego, and superego, with the conscious being above the waterline, preconscious and unconscious being beneath the waterline. And of course, as we all know, the unconscious plays a significant role in the thought process of Freud. So, looking at Leibniz, Goethe, and Herbart, Leibniz's monadology proposed levels of awareness from clear to unaware. Goethe described human existence as consisting of a constant struggle between conflicting emotions and tendencies which no doubt influenced Freud, as Goethe was one of Freud's favorite authors. Herbart suggested that there was a threshold above which an idea is conscious and below which an idea is unconscious, that we have no awareness of it. And as we saw in the previous lecture of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, Schopenhauer believed that humans were governed more by irrational desires than by reason. He also anticipated Freud's concept of repression and sublimation. Nietzsche also saw humans as engaged in perpetual battle between the irrational and the rational. So, some of the borrowed components. Freud borrowed, in addition to those items that we saw with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, Fechner's concept of the iceberg to explain consciousness and unconsciousness. Helmholtz's concept of the conservation of energy within humans influenced Freud to postulate the use of psychic energy to be distributed in various ways. So Freud's theories. It may be said that Freud's theory was a synthesizing of his philosophical heritage and a product of the zeitgeist of his time. So one of the key influences on Freud was Brücke. He had influence obviously from his parents, his relationship with them. Freud's knowledge of his parents' relationship and the relationship with his mother influenced him greatly, as did Brücke. Freud credited Brücke as the person who most influenced him during his medical studies. He experimented with cocaine. Freud began experimenting with cocaine. He found it as a very beneficial and had no side effects. That was Freud's take at the time. Freud gave it to a colleague who then became an addict. The man died a cocaine addict. This did hurt Freud's reputation. It was damaged, and this led to further skepticism to his theory. Joseph Breuer. Freud worked with Breuer with one of his famous cases of Anna O. In this case, he used hypnosis as his therapeutic method, but Breuer found that discovering the origin of her physical symptoms, which were usually very traumatic experiences, resulted in the symptoms being relieved. A common theme that we see today, that sometimes when you're able to confront the cause of things and why things may have occurred, you tend to get some relief from it. He called this the cathartic method. The phenomena which were to be called transference and countertransferred were also observed during this case. Chirac. Freud studied with Chirac for a while, during which he learned several lessons which later influenced him in his work. First, the development of free association. Freud found hypnosis to be ineffective in several cases. Thus, he attempted to find another method. Eventually, he found simply encouraging the patient to speak freely about whatever comes to mind seemed to work just as well as hypnosis at uncovering memories, once you get past the resistance displayed by the patient. So getting them to open up, to be quite blunt and frank as to what they want to talk about, seems to be somewhat beneficial. So some of the early influences on the development of his psychoanalysis. Well, the basic ideas of psychoanalysis provides a number of basic ideas. Symptoms can be symbolic representations of underlying traumatic experiences or conflicts, which are repressed. The repressed experiences or conflicts do not go away. So if we had some sort of issues and it was never resolved, we may have repressed it. And these things may bubble up later in life and cause us all sorts of issues. The most effective way to make repressed material conscious is through free association. Openly and honestly, just talking about whatever comes to mind. Unconscious motivation. An important element of psychoanalysis, and Freud emphasized the role of sex in unconscious motivation. So here we start to see one of his key focuses, the role of sex in loads of behavior. Also, he also came up with this notion that to be an effective as an analyst, a psychoanalyst, Freud believed to be effective, you had to be psychoanalyzed, which he did himself. Obviously, there were not many psychoanalysts around, so he had to do it to himself, and that's what he did. Well, he developed also a project of scientific psychology, trying to make psychology more scientific. From his work with patients with hysteria, he concluded that sexual attack was the basis of all hysteria. This was called seduction theory. He received at least some criticism for the proposal. He later abandoned this idea. But we may ask ourselves, why the focus on dreams? Why? Well, remember, in order to be an effective psychoanalyst, you had to be psychoanalyzed. Well, there really weren't anyone more than him. There was no person around to psychoanalyze him and the techniques that he had developed. Because there was no person to psychoanalyze him, he must do it himself. He could not use free association himself, so he needed another avenue for his self-analysis to get at the depths of his unconscious. He determined that dreams could be a symbolic representation of his repressed thoughts. Ergo, dream analysis became a second method for tapping into the unconscious. So the method of dream analysis. Well, you're probably familiar with this from previous classes. Well, we have the manifest content and the latent content. The manifest content is what the dream is apparently about. It is merely about the description of what happened during the dream. I woke up, I did this, I did that, I met this person, and so on. That is the description of what went on in the dream. Its apparent meaning. However, there's also latent content, what the dream was really about. And this is the basis of his dream analysis, that dreams have at least a dual meaning. What the dream demonstrated or illustrated is mere description of the dream, and then what the dream really means, and that is the latent content. That involves the psychoanalyst interpreting the dream, figuring out what these symbols, the things that happened during this dream, what do they actually represent. Also, when it comes to dream, he saw it as being wish fulfillment. Every dream is wish fulfillment, a symbolic expression of a wish that the dreamer could not express or satisfy directly without experiencing anxiety. Another key aspect of Freud's thoughts here. We have all this stuff in the unconscious, things and conflicts and issues that we have not been able to deal with, that we may even have repressed. And then we have the idea of anxiety. Things that are not proper or appropriate, that are part of the things that we may want to desire, causes anxiety in us. So in the method of dream analysis, he referred to something as dream work, which is to analyze dreams properly, one must be trained to understand dream work, which disguises the wish actually being expressed in the dream. So you have to look at what is being presented to you and uncover what the true meaning is. If you go to any bookstore, by the way, today, you'll probably see whole sections on dream analysis. This idea, as well as several other ideas that Freud came up with, still ring quite readily and loudly in the heart of much of the population still today. So Looking at dream work again, it includes condensation. One element of a dream symbolizes several things in waking life. And displacement, where one dreams about something symbolically similar to an anxiety-provoking event. So again, it's very much like detective work. All right. So with the dream work, we see this as being one way to try to tap in to that unconscious, to try to find out and root out those issues that may have been unresolved, not dealt with, causing conflicts and or issues so anxiety provoking that they cause you to repress them in your unconscious. Then we have the Oedipus complex. Two So the Oedipus complex. Through Freud's own dream analysis, he confirmed his belief that young males tend to love their mothers and hate their fathers. From this, infantile sexuality became an important ingredient in his general theory of unconscious motivation, and we'll see more on this a little bit later. Parapraxis are relatively minor errors in everyday living. Slips of the tongue, forgetting things, losing things, small accidents, or mistakes in writing. So the key thing here, from Freud's perspective, is that there are really no accidents like this, no real slips of the tongue. They all have some sort of meaning. So all behavior is motivated, but the causes of behavior are usually unconscious. Therefore, people seldom know why they act as they do, often unconsciously motivated. So behavior is overdetermined, which means that behavior often has more than one cause. Additionally, in everyday life, we see humor. People would often use humor, per Freud, in the form of jokes to express unacceptable sexual and aggressive tendencies. So someone may say somewhat off-color joke or somewhat joke that may be slightly inappropriate. This may indicate something that is unacceptable within that person, possibly at an unconscious level. And his take on religion. The basis of religion is the human feeling of helplessness and insecurity. So, why was Freud such a big deal? Well, let's talk a little bit about what happened. Freud was like many others in the early days of psychology, coming up with theories and approaches to things. But in 1909, he was invited to Clark University by Stanley Hall. Not just him alone, there were several other people that were invited too. And he was to give a series of lectures, as were some of the others. His lectures were criticized, but reactions were generally favorable. So his series of 5 lectures was later expanded into his influential introductory lectures of psychoanalysis. Growth of Freud's fame in psychoanalysis occurred at this point. After his visit, Freud's fame and that of psychoanalysis grew very, very rapidly. And if you look at movies, some old movies you would say that happened like in the 1950s or even a little bit before then, you often sometimes will see intellectuals gathered around in a scene, gathered around in a study or library discussing the ideas of Freud and psychoanalysis. So let's look at one of the key things that we note, and one of the reasons also why we still talk about Freud today, one of the first to really give a very comprehensive idea and look into personality. So let's review Freud's theory of personality. So early theory differentiated among the idea of the conscious, those things which we are unaware of at a given moment. We are aware of at a given moment. The preconscious, things of which we can bring into awareness relatively easily, but not aware of at that time. And the unconscious, memories which are being actively repressed. He later expanded his views with the concepts of id, ego, and superego. So he just differentiated between conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, and then expanded when it comes to the concepts that you're probably most familiar with, id, ego, superego. Let's talk about the id. The driving force of personality. It contains all your instincts, and these instincts sometimes are not going to be nice things. It is entirely unconscious. It's governed by the pleasure principle. The collective energy of the instincts is called libido and accounts for most human behavior. And it's also believed, per Freud, that we are born with this id. We come prepackaged with the id. Everything is instinctual. It's all about pleasure. The pleasure principle being the guiding factor. Then we have the ego, aware of the needs of the id in the physical world. The major job is to coordinate the two. The id in dealing with the world in front of you. It is to satisfy the id's needs and desires by the reality principle because it satisfies the needs in the real world. The ego is most often described as you. You are the ego. You are that individual that tries to deal with those beasts in the basement, the id, and operate within the world around you, especially within this civilized world. So you don't do anything too crazy. The ego's there to manage that, your interaction with the real world. Then we have the superego. As the child internalizes the do's and don'ts, the superego develops. So in this instance, we have to develop a superego, the moral part of our personality. So in many ways, what we're looking at here is learning from our parents and our teachers as we are growing up through infancy and childhood and adolescence to try to internalize the rules of society. So this superego, it has two divisions. The conscience contains the experiences for which the child has been consistently punished, engaging in or thinking about. Engaging in these activities causes the child to feel guilty. And the ego ideal contains the experiences for which the child has been rewarded. This is what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and what you should do, basically. Engaging or thinking about engaging in such activities makes the child feel good about himself or herself. So the superego has this idea of what is the good stuff to do and what is the bad stuff to do. And you have internalized the rules of your parents, your grandparents, and hopefully of society. In addition, we see these life and death instincts of Freud's. Life instincts, eros, including such things as sex, hunger, and thirst. These instincts are there to prolong life. Death instincts, thanatos, seek to terminate life. These instincts manifest as suicide, masochism, and or aggression. So let's look a little bit more at some of these other ideas of anxiety. First, we have anxiety. As we've talked about in the previous slides so far, is that we have the unconscious, the things that are conflicting us, the things that we have don't like that cause this great deal of anxiety and we want to repress. So we have anxiety. And so in order to deal with anxiety, the ego must manage it. It has to do something. And so Freud came up with mechanisms that would deal with the anxiety that the ego may come into contact with based on all the stuff going on in the unconscious and all the struggles that's happening there. The three types of anxiety: we have objective anxiety, an objective threat from the outside to the person, neurotic anxiety, when the ego feels that is going to be overwhelmed by the id, moral anxiety, when an internalized value is or is about to be violated, similar to shame or guilt. So objective anxiety, you are being threatened from something outside of you. Neurotic anxiety, the ego feels that it's going to be overwhelmed by that monster in the basement, the id. And moral anxiety, when an internalized value that you learned from your mother, your father, your grandparents in society, when an internalized value is or is about to be violated, leading to potentially shame or guilt. So one of the ego's jobs is to deal with that anxiety. To deal with objective anxiety, the ego must deal with the physical environment. To deal with neurotic and moral anxiety, the ego must use one or more processes called ego defense mechanisms to make sure that they feel okay, that you can keep existing in your life without too much fear and stress. So, let's look at a couple of these real quickly. Then we look at a whole list of them. We have the ego defense mechanisms. We have repression. Ideas, memories, desires, which are in the unconscious, can enter consciousness only is in disguised form, so they do not cause anxiety. These ideas, memories, and desires are said to be repressed. We have displacement, replacing an object or goal that produces anxiety with one that does not. So we have this thing, it causes us too much anxiety, so we replace that with something that does not cause us as much. Some of the other ego defense mechanisms, we have sublimation, the expression of sexual urges indirectly through socially acceptable ways such as poetry, art, religion. Projection, when one sees undesirable urges and secret desires as belonging to another person and not oneself. So whatever's in you, you're projecting onto someone else. Identification, one begins to act like someone else to fulfill needs. Rationalization, one that we see quite often, providing a rational, logical, but false reason for a failure or shortcoming. For example, you find a wad of money in your neighborhood. You see somebody walking away in the distance on the sidewalk, you see there's a few $1,000s there, you pick it up. Do you go run and give the money back to the person you assume it belongs to? Or do you keep it? Let's say you keep it. Well, you kept the money, maybe based on what the id emphasized you to do or your ego, but you kept the money. In order to feel okay about keeping, let's say, $5,000 of found money, you need to rationalize why you're able to do that. Give you a reason, a false reason, but a reason why you did it. So let's say, well, obviously this money is drug money. If I'm able to maintain and keep this money, I can put it to good or keep it out of their hands that would do nothing but put bad back into my neighborhood. A rationalization. We have reaction formation. When a person has a desire to do something, but doing it causes great anxiety, they do the opposite of what they really want to do. And here are some of the others. We've talked about repression. We've denial. You see something, it's blocking external events from awareness. If some situation is just too much to handle, the person just refuses to experience it. We talked about sublimation already a little bit, and regression. Basically, this is a movement back in psychological time when one is faced with less stress. So a child may begin to suck their thumb again or wet the bed when they need to spend some time in the hospital. So they regress back in order to make themselves feel more comfortable. Alright, before I start too deeply into this, I'll go ahead and pause here, and we'll pick up here next on the psychosexual stages of development. And this is where we see some of that controversy that I referred to a little bit earlier.